So we have a couple questions that have already come in. So if everyone is ready, I'll start choosing some of these questions to read out. So I have one here from Jeff Playfair, and he is asking, at the time, how radical was the idea of setting aside Garibaldi Park?
Go for it, Carl.
I was going to say, I think this is Carl for sure.
Well, it was like pulling a tooth. The government acknowledged that this was a very special area. And after much prodding by the British Columbia Mountaineering Club, over a period of at least 15 years, in 1920, they set it aside as a park reserve. And then it took another 7 years or 8 years to actually be proclaimed a provincial park. That was not the first provincial park in British Columbia. That was Strathcona on Vancouver Island. You would have thought after the Strathcona exercise, there would be a little more on the bit and get on with it. But no, there are other interests in this game. There was timber reserves around the base of Garibaldi Park. And the government was very cautious, making sure that good timber was not being put into the park and it could be put into the government coffers instead. That's just one example. There are others. There were many mining interests. In decades to come, there are native concerns, of course. But at any rate, it's been a tough exercise until there was a big shift in government in the 1970s when the NDP came into power. Suddenly, new parks were proclaimed everywhere. I take that literally. But there was no money set aside to hire park wardens to look after them. And that's the way it is today. Go ahead, Glenn, finish it off.
At the time, and continuing today, most people didn't realize that the indigenous people tramped through a lot of the country, most of the country, had their own names for things, other than those put on by Eurocentric people. And they basically said, okay, I've been reading some stuff from the 1880s about what was going on up in the Nass Valley, up in the Nisga'a territory recently. And I was reading the proceeds of a symposium dealing with Nisga'a country in the 1880s. And the government basically said, well, too bad, Nisga'a people, it's our land now, we're taking it. And so we'll partition it up the way we want. And the first priority will be industry and white settlers and so forth, and you guys can have the crumbs. So the indigenous people had their own spiritual things, which might be somewhat analogous to parks, maybe not, but none of that was given any credence until quite recently.
Okay. Well, we have some more questions that have come in. So from Dan Richardson, we have the question, some of us are old enough to have experiences of using maps without GPS. But how would mountaineering and the culture around it have been different if reliable maps, i.e. proper geometry as opposed to hand-drawn from estimation, had never been developed? Clearly, this would have been a massive revision in history, but I'm just curious if Carl and Glenn would care to ruminate on this idea. Perhaps it is something more approaching an oral tradition than a written one in a sense, ... Any comments on that?
Well,
Sorry, go ahead, Carl, go ahead.
The classic good mountaineering maps were in the Alps almost from the turn of the century. And it was very slow in developing that style of mapping until A.O. Wheeler started the process in the Selkirks in the early 1900s. And then when he did the boundary survey between British Columbia and Alberta, he upped the ante by making a series of very good topographic maps along the boundary between Waterton Park on the American border, and to as far north as somewhere around Pine Pass, or maybe not that far north, but anyway, in that ballpark. And then it seems to come to a grinding halt again, and the maps didn't come about until aerial photos were flown by the RCAF in the 1947s and 45, 46, 47. And these were very unusual aerial photographs in that they were taking 3 photographs at the same time, one straight down, one to the left, one to the right. They were called trimetricon photographs. And those are the photographs that Neil used a lot in order to make his maps, which we've come to rely upon for 20, 30 years thereafter. Go ahead, Glenn.
I don't think there's much difference in how mountaineers approach the land with or without good maps. We used to pore over what we had and say, okay, that looks like an interesting area. Look at all the ice that they've tentatively mapped up there, or all the stuff. There's no names in this area. That means that on the map, what there is, that means it might be worth going and seeing what's there. And we did quite a bit of that, just going to see what was there in effect. And I think the same thing happens. A good friend of mine, John Clark, would spend hours poring over quite decent topographic maps, looking for routes through through the high reaches of the coast mountains and things. Spend days poring over these things and then trying to figure out how he puts all this together. It's all exploration, and that's what people still do today for the most part, and what we did.
Great. We have a more general question coming in from Wesley Wenhart. Carl and Glenn, what were your both memorable summits? Where and why?
Go ahead, Glenn.
For me, probably a peak called Sarah 5 in the Waddington area, because it was hard. It was one of the top prizes in North America. It's still very seldom climbed. Only as the guidebooks say, only the very best people managed to get up it, and it was scary. And we both nearly got killed a few times on the way down. We shouldn't be here. And another one was Mount Raleigh, which was one of the things that Neil charted, and which Arnold Shives and I did for the second ascent. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful, non-scary, gorgeous day in the mountains, the type of thing that makes you realize there's more out there than just you, and it's nice to be alive and pay attention.
Okay, it's my turn. Well, the most aesthetic and beautiful and tough climb in my life is easily Mount Tasman in New Zealand. Mount Tasman, a phenomenal climb. You're on the front points of your crampons for nearly 10 hours for the day. No room for air anywhere along the climb, up or down. But I did it on a beautiful day with another New Zealander. And I really felt I had really accomplished something when I finished that climb. That was the good one. The bad one is Table Mountain in Garibaldi Park. How do you climb vertical, rotten volcanic rock whose stability is next to nothing? I and a gentleman by the name of Dr. Seth Hayberg climbed it the day after a famous mountaineer, Dick Culver, climbed it solo. I still don't see how he did it solo. We had a very tough time doing it as a duo with some protection. Table Mountain is definitely the most horrifying climb I've ever done. I'm glad I've done it, but I'll never do it again.
Okay. Speaking of climbing, though, we do have a gear question from Ivan Petrov. How would Carl and Glenn compare the older style of hobnail boots to modern day mountaineering boots? Would they consider wearing hobnail boots today for nostalgia or any other reasons?
I used to use what they call tricone nails, which are basically fancy gussing up hobnails, so to speak. They were very, very good on on things like dirt, mud, crossing slippery logs in the morning, steep snow, ice. They're excellent for that. Not so good in rock, but so I wouldn't go back to them, to those things. But I remember I was sitting here waiting for a helicopter to go someplace there, and there's some very well-known climbers camped next to us, and we got talking about this equipment, and they said, it's just amazing, this modern stuff, and which it is, sticky rubber and tents that don't leak and decent ropes and things like that. And they said it's just amazing. And I said, well, the old stuff was pretty good too. If you look at what they used on Everest and things, pretty amazing. So you use what you've got at the time and make do with it.
Well, I never climbed the hobnails. I once for my father's hobnails, which he used in the Chilliwack Valley in the 1930s. And I said, never again. I climbed mainly with Vibram sole climbing boots, but the going got very tough. I had what they called a clutter shoe, which in the 50s and 60s was the shoe to wear when you're doing tough rock climbing. And that made all the difference in the world. Where clutter shoes have gone now, I don't know. They've been replaced by even fancier stuff where the sole actually sticks to the rock. I've never used those, but that's the way it goes.
Okay, we have quite a few questions in here, but I'm going to try for some variation. Doug Wiley has asked, can you comment on how the recession of the glaciers will change the climbing opportunities and perhaps their difficulties?
Well, as the glaciers recede, the berg shrouds get bigger. They're tougher to cross. And in some aspects, the crevasses grow wider, or if you're lucky, they close up again. That's one aspect. The other is the glaciers don't go to near the summits like they used to. So there's no free ride to the summit on a glacier, or very few. So that's it in a nutshell. As for traversing glaciers in the valley situation, they're shorter. So you have to walk over more rock and rubble before you get onto ice, where the walking is more pleasant. But on the other hand, at the expense of maybe more crevasses or more mill holes where water is rushing down the glacier and into gigantic holes, because you have to cross these streams on the glacier surface, some of which are fairly tough to cross.
Most of our big steep granitic walls, which are much in vogue with people these days, with good reason, not just in places like Squamish, but also in Patagonia and Alaska. Many of those walls had their origins in glacial processes. And so I have some, and of course in Baffin Island. So I think that as the glaciers recede in the polar regions, we're probably going to see more and bigger walls developing over the next century or two, like that. So there might be more scope for the rock climbers, but for the alpine traveler, the travel on the glaciers is much tougher now than it used to be. The glaciers are more broken up and more crevassed and often quite difficult.
Okay, so we have a bit of a funding and politics question here from Ingrid Gutzman. Question for both Carl and Glenn. It seems underfunding of our provincial parks is a perennial problem. Despite this negative setting, do you have any ideal or thoughts on how we can get sufficient funding in place? In other words, how do you think we can get the government to put the appropriate funding in place?
I think that's tied in with a whole bunch of questions. It basically requires government and societal change. So yes, the underfunding of the parks is a big issue. The underfunding of the arts is a huge issue. The underfunding of green energy is big. The underfunding of Indigenous communities is huge. And I don't think there's a simple answer to. I also don't, it requires a cultural change. Just throwing money at parks doesn't really work. If you throw money at parks, it tends to get used on projects which really aren't really all that good, because management of parks is basically top down these days, and often the bottom up people don't have too much say, or just lip service in what what we do. So I don't know the answer to that. How do we change society?
Well, if we had a cabinet in government where every member of the cabinet was an outdoors person or a natural scientist, I'm sure the scene would change fairly quickly. But the chances of getting a cabinet like that in the government is next to nil. And with the COVID crisis draining the pot right now, it's going to be a long time before we're going to see any more money going into parks.
But I can definitely say that I feel like here in Vancouver and North Vancouver, this pandemic has definitely introduced outdoor activities to a much wider audience, and it's been incredible to see how many people are trying to get outside and enjoy and engage with the mountains and the forests and the ocean. And on that note, this is a more personal question. I'd love to ask it to Carl and Glenn, because you really do have that personal connection with Neil Carter. So from Manrico Scrumman, we have, can you tell us more about Neil Carter's personal life, his family, and his children? And before I have both of you respond to that, I will say that we have some family members, I believe, on the Zoom webinar today, and I have also been in contact with his granddaughter and great-granddaughter by email today. So his family does know about this conversation, the video, they will have access to it. And I'll just point out to any of our listeners that if you're interested in seeing more images about Neil Carter from his photographic album and learning a bit more about who he was as a man, the Archives of North Vancouver up in Lynn Valley will be opening an exhibit by appointment starting in April, so that you can come in. And right behind Glenn right now, Glenn Woodsworth, are some images from the photographic albums that have been enlarged and selected and are in the archives right now. And of course, also on our website, we have digitized entirely one of Neil Carter's 1920s photographic album, and you can flip through it and zoom into it and look at the index and find and see the beautiful illustrations and the time and energy that Neil Carter put into illustrating and annotating his photographs. So on that note, though, I will ask Glenn and Carl to respond to Manrico's question.
I can't add much, so it's up to Carl.
Well, I knew his daughter, Louise, very well. I met her initially in Ottawa when I was passing through Ottawa, when she was rock climbing nearby in Lexville, I think it is. And Louise then moved to Western Canada with her new husband, Billy Schmidt. And I got to know them quite well here, and they accompanied me on several trips while they lived in Canada. Neil Carter's grandson needed a pair of climbing boots, and I had a pair of boots which were reportedly very good, but didn't fit me worth a darn. So I sold them to his grandson. Okay, and I think he was a good climber.
Okay, well, and Paul Geddes has put into the questions, where can we read more about Neil Carter? So in addition to the materials that we have here at the Archives of North Vancouver, I also want to acknowledge the archival collection of materials of Neil Carter's that are held by the Whistler Museum and Archives, and that is actually the location from which we are seeing Carl Ricker speak to us, thanks to their curator, Brad, who has been working alongside us throughout this entire conversation and the event. And without his support, this wouldn't be possible. So I also will encourage people to go there. And then of course, the White Museum, and I know the archivist from the White Museum is on this event today too, also has many of the, has the Fond of the Alpine Club of Canada, their archival records can be found there. So introducing some of you, I know Paul is aware of this, but introducing some of you to the web of archival institutions that have both the British Columbia Mountaineering Club records here at the Archives of North Vancouver, but also some of those are spread out with the White Museum and the Whistler Museum, both of those institutions having archives as well. So we'll try and make sure that in the chat we're putting as many links for you as possible, but we also will have links available on the Neil Carter exhibition website, which is on our Minova.ca website. So people can get more information about the amazing climber Neil Carter and his life. And we have a few more minutes here for some questions. So I'm just going to bring up one that I saw here. As a SAR member from Jeff Playfair, I sometimes wonder about the old days when you sort of apprenticed over a period of years with an older, more experienced person to learn how to handle yourself safely in the backcountry versus today when a GPS or a smartphone with an app is often considered all you need to pursue your attempt at YouTube fame. I'm curious if Glenn and Carl have some thoughts on this.
I think one of the great virtues of the clubs, particularly in the old days, was that you could join these things as a newbie. They take in trips and they teach you, not formally, but you learn by doing and learn by watching. Very much sort of an apprentice type thing, but nothing formal about it. The other way people did, of course, because there are no courses to take as such, is you get some friends together and you go out there and you start doing stuff on your own, and you know, you learn by doing, but you learn by teaching yourself. Both ways have their merits. The second way, of course, tends to be more dangerous because people often don't make it. And Carl and I have both lost friends who taught themselves that way. And we've also both lost friends who have learned that through the clubs. But going through the clubs is wonderful, a wonderful way to learn, and it continues to be a good way. The clubs will take you, and you know, basically, you learn by osmosis. Teach you what you need to know.
I am a firm believer in going with people who know what they're doing. I'm not too impressed with the gadgetry that's floating around nowadays. I think that's a recipe of false security, frankly. You're better off going with a knowledgeable leader who has dealt with all sorts of issues over his course of mountaineering, and you'll be better for it by doing it. The other thing is clubs have rock schools, they still do. I'm a firm believer in going to rock schools. This could be after supper or a day on a weekend. There are plenty of them around nowadays. In the old days, the only rock school was in two places, Vancouver, White Atkinson, or the North Van Rock Quarry. It's changed dramatically since then, but nonetheless, rock schools are important, and going with people who know what they're doing is very important. I'm not an advocate of people sitting out on their own, trying to explore their own mind and what they can do on their own. It just doesn't cut it with me. Thank you.
Okay, this is a bit of a think back question. It's from Darrell Carlson saying, hello, did you ever climb with or know of Fred Roots or Martin and Esther, I'm going to pronounce it as Kafer or Kaffer, former Whistler volunteer ski patrollers?
Yeah, the Kafer, Martin, and Esther, they're the honorary presidents now of the BC Mountaineering Club. And I know them well. I've known them for 60 years now or something like that. They're doing well. They live in Vancouver, and they're both doing fine. They're both in their 90s and they're doing well. Fred Roots I only met once or twice, but he was a neat guy. He did his PhD at Princeton, working up in north central British Columbia, and doing things like living on stuff like canned cat food and dog food, because that's what he got the most nutrition per pound. He had to carry everything, of course. This was in the 40s up north of Manson Creek. his son eventually joined the Geological Survey, my organization, and his first summer at the GSC was as a field assistant of mine. So I got to know Charlie quite well, and he was also really, really good guy, amazing guy, and he died natural causes a few years ago. Fred was quite the person. He spent time down in Antarctica as well, and I remember one time he had to do some operation which required, I think it was taking somebody's eye out if they become badly infected. You couldn't just whip out in no time from Antarctica. So they got talked through this on the radio, and Fred had to do this thing. Fred is not a medical doctor. He's a doctor of earth science. And anyway, they got the job done. Amazing person. So are the Kafers, amazing people.
I'll add something to that. Fred Roots was a gung-ho engineer, geologist in the Varsity Outdoor Club in the 1940s. I think he was the president of the club one year. He's the one that initiated the Garibaldi spring ski camps, which the outdoor club did for years and years and years before they found other places to go in recent decades. Fred was also the leader of the first Canadian Himalayan expedition, and I convinced him to take that job when I saw him in Ottawa one time. But basically, Fred's life was in the polar regions, and I would call him Canada's unofficial polar diplomat, working on many issues in polar regions, north and south, trying to solve problems amongst nations which were developing in the polar regions. And that is one of his big contributions to his career. A perfect gentleman. He knew what he was doing and found ways of getting it done.
Great, thanks for that question. Okay, there's a question here. Are the lads aware of now it says FR Damascus Payne, and I'm not sure, I'm sorry what the FR stands for, who was a monk. Oh, well, there you go. Who was a monk up at the Westminster Abbey in Mission, BC, and took many photos from his climbs. He passed away tragically on a fall, and there may be a mountain named after him. Do either of you know anything about that, him or that?
Yes, there's somebody in the audience who would know far more than I do, but not on this particular screen. Yes,
Oh, okay.
it was Father Damasus, and he was a great influence not on me, but on one of the really foremost modern explorers at the Coast Mountains, John Clark, and who knew him very well and spent time with him and things. But Father Damasus, he climbed all over in the local areas, and particularly up on Mission. I think he lived at, he was affiliated with the monastery up there. Again, pretty amazing person, and a very good influence, and a very good person, kind person, and great influence on people and young people. There is a mountain named after him, and I think it might be Mount Payne, which was his given name, his surname.
Great, thank you for shedding some light on that. We have about 3 minutes left in the set 1 hour program, and there's been several questions around naming. So I have one question here for Carl, and then I'm going to ask Alice Gus to address some of the questions we've been receiving around Indigenous names and naming of different mountains. So the first question here is for Carl, and it's from Ingrid, and it says, how did you get the names for the peaks through the spearhead? Any historical context?
Okay. The Spearhead Range was surveyed by A.J. Campbell for the provincial government in the process of getting a map made of Garibaldi Park. He named several features on that range, and the most interesting one was Tremor Mountain. How did he arrive at the name of Tremor Mountain? They experienced an earthquake while they were on the summit, in their observations. So based on that, we use other similar names to name the glaciers and peaks around Tremor Mountain, Shatter Mountain, Shutter Mountain, Shatter Glacier, etc. Tremor Glacier. That was one of our fallbacks. And Neil Carter had warned us that this was how Tremor Mountain had got its name. Neil knows everything, of course. And we had other people at this committee for names who had suggestions. One was Roy Hooley, who was witnessing the demise of the closure of the Kettle Valley Railroad. He was concerned that all those neat station names along the Kettle Valley Railroad were going to disappear forever. And so he suggested several which should be incorporated in the Spearhead Range, Iago Mountain, for example, Benvolio in the Fitzsimmons Range nearby. So that's Macbeth Glacier, Macbeth Peak, all names that the CPR was using on the Kettle Valley Railroad, and just shifted over to the Spearhead Range and the Fitzsimmons Range. And the other names were from what things looked like to us or what we experienced. So Fissile Mountain, people keep asking, what is that? Well, the rock on Fissile Mountain is very fissile, a geological term, breaks up easily into many pieces. So there we are. And so we got Fissile Mountain. Decker Mountain, that was Bert Port's suggestion, because when he looked at the mountain as he was skiing by it, looked like a series of decks. That was how that one happened. And Mrs. Mundy had told us that they had named the range, the Spearhead Range, when they were there to climb Mount Blackcomb back in the 1920s. So we took on some of the names involved with the Spearhead. Phalanx Glacier was Neil Carter's suggestion for the peak next to the Spearhead. A phalanx is a moving wedge in military terms, and the mountain looked like a moving wedge from certain angles. This is how the names came about. Some names, Singing Pass, for example, had replaced the name of Avalanche Pass, which Mrs. Mundy had decided that Creek was singing and should be called Singing Pass. So we used the singing possibilities for other stuff in the area. So Pluto, Piccolo Peaks, for example, Melody Creek, for example, Harmony Bowl, for example, all on this theme of music. And that's how these names came about. All were discussed endlessly in several meetings, and we made the decision to submit them. Of course, the flying ointment was London Mountain, which appeared on the maps. How did London Mountain get its name? And all the locals in the early days were calling it Whistler Mountain. It turns out that the London mining claims were on Whistler Mountain, and the Victoria people decided that it should become London Mountain because of the London mining claims. And we said that's bogus. We insisted that it be renamed Whistler Mountain. And so it came to pass. I'll leave it there, okay?
Okay. Unless Glenn has something to add, I think that's a wonderful opportunity to turn the mic over to Alice. She's already been responding in the chat to some questions around the creation story of Mount Garibaldi and sort of speaking to the naming of mountains. So Alice?
Awesome. So first of all, I just want to thank Glenn and Carl for sharing their wisdom, sharing their thoughts, sharing their experiences, and hands go up to Neil for all the good work and their team for doing all the good work back in the past. Like I say, I live in Squamish, and 360 degrees around us, there are what they call landmarks, but those landmarks, they actually have legends. The Great Flood is a bit longer, but I'll just share about the Black Tusk. So you guys are aware Black Tusk is just behind Mount Garibaldi to Chikite. So Black Tusk was actually the landing place of our Thunderbird. So there was the supernatural bird who had enormous talons, and he crushed this peak. So long ago, Skoik, which we call Raven, was livid with the frog. Skoik picked up the frog and he carried him high into the sky. And the frog protested and he demanded, he goes, I want to put back down to the ground. And Skoik, the raven, granted his wish by dropping him from the skies. And just as the frog flailed, he grasped at the clouds, tearing a large hole, causing torrential rain which flooded the land. This disturbed the thunderbird, the Ain Yahashan, who opened his eyes and he was sending lightning across the land. He was flapping his wings, causing havoc and destruction. Frog landed in the floodwaters, nearly hitting Yo-Yo's, which you know as killer whale. Yo-Yo slapped his tail and he was thrashing about, sending tidal waves in all directions, decimating most remaining of the people. So this series of events initiated the Great Flood. And we all know this is one of the universal universal stories to many cultures. And the other one is the Great Flood, but I think that one's going to take a little bit longer. But the Great Flood is actually from Mount Garibaldi too. So I'll just do a really short version. There were the three men. We have the prophet, the doctor, and the medicine man. And the doctor and the medicine man, they had a lot of power, but the prophet, he could see into the future. So our people back in the day, then they were start getting greedy and not doing things, the right way. They weren't sharing and all that stuff. And they told them, says, if you guys don't do, how we were in the past, and then something's going to happen. So the prophet, he got up and he told him, he goes, you know what, there's something going to happen because you guys not listening, you young ones. So because they weren't listening, and then there was the Great Flood. And so the people that listened to the prophet, the people that listened to them prepared themselves. So they put all their gear in the canoes and they tied it on the peaks of Mount Garibaldi. We call it Chikite. And then the other peaks was like Black Tusk. So all the towering peaks right around Squamish. So Chikite, one of the other questions was when someone asked, it would be nice if they would name some of the mountains back, to the original, like Mount Garibaldi. Mount Garibaldi, you guys are all aware that he never set foot here in Squamish, but the mountain was named after him. And here in Squamish, we call it Chikite. In North Vancouver, they call it Inchikite. It just depends on the families, the teachings of, the names of the mountains. So it's just like potato, potato, tomato, tomato. We would kind of know what you're talking about. So did I answer that question? Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Alice, for sharing that with us. And I just want to start to wrap things up and let you know, as our audience, that Alice Gus is working with our programming department and is working towards some of the excellent future programs and events that are going to be available at the new museum, Minova, which will be opening in 2021, later in 2021, in the Shipyards region, which is Lower Lonsdale. And we will be having in our feature exhibit mountaineering objects, artifacts, stories, highlighting people like Phyllis Monday, who was mentioned, and other climbers. So we look forward to inviting everyone once we are open at the new museum. And until then, if anyone wants to come by appointment to the archives in North Vancouver, like I said, we'll be opening the Neil Carter exhibition in April, and you can actually come and see in real life the photographic albums that were donated to the archives, and look through them with the archives team, as well as seeing some of the other photographs and learning a bit more about him. And I just want to give my deepest gratitude to all of our speakers today, especially Carl and Glenn, for taking the time out of their schedules to have not only one conversation, but really two with me last month and this month. I've learned so much about not only Neil Carter, but the amazing and vibrant mountaineering community that we have in the Coast Mountains here. And as you mentioned throughout this talk, how vital these mountaineering groups are towards ensuring the protection of our wilderness, and also for training and inspiring young climbers and mountaineers for future generations. So Carl, Glenn, thank you very, very much.